My fellow Americans, as Richard Nixon would say, this is a brief video and slide presentation about Korea and Vietnam. First thing to remember is that a lot of what we have covered in the last part of this course is all interrelated. Uh, the fear of appeasing aggression, as we believed the Europeans had done before World War II, the Cold War, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, Korea and Vietnam, they're all interconnected. Because of the fear of communism and the fear of repeating the mistake of appeasement, the United States was led to believe that our national interests were at stake in both Korea and Vietnam. Many today would suggest that no, they probably weren't. As Muhammad Ali said, Muhammad Ali, of course, had the crown as the world boxing champion, but the title was taken away from him when he refused induction into the military and went to prison. Muhammad Ali said, I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. And after the experience of Vietnam, many Americans came to see that that was the correct idea. Korea and Vietnam were in some ways similar, in some ways very different. Korea was a conventional war of military forces on both sides, not a guerrilla type war or an insurgency like you see in South Vietnam, where the Viet Cong in South Vietnam were people within that nation itself who were opposing their own government. I'm not going to talk a great deal about the Korean War because I want to get on to the Vietnam War. But this map illustrates very clearly that this war went through vast shifts very quickly and then kind of stalemated for the last 2 years or so of the fighting. On June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the demilitarized zone, the border between these two zones of occupation that had been left after World War II. The Soviet Union had occupied North Korea, and the United States had occupied South Korea. This first map illustrates that within a very short time, by September of 1950, the North Korean forces had just about pushed South Korean and UN forces. Most of the UN forces were US troops, but there were a few thousand troops from other nations. But the South Korean and UN forces had virtually been pushed out of South Korea down to what is called the Pusan perimeter in the very southeast part of the Korean peninsula. As I said a moment ago, the forces aiding the South Koreans were UN forces, but they were led by General Douglas MacArthur, the old hero from the Pacific War in World War II. And while a United Nations flag flew over his headquarters, 90% of his troops were American. Now, MacArthur was kind of a prima donna, but also had some aspects of military genius. And the Incheon landing was one of his moments of genius. In September 1950, he used amphibious forces to launch a landing behind the enemy lines at Incheon near the South Korean capital of Seoul. Then the UN forces went on the offensive and began pushing north. And the war goes through another swift change. Eventually, these maps don't show it very well, but eventually the UN forces were about to push North Korea completely out of North Korea. And that's when the Chinese intervened. Now, there is evidence today that MacArthur's staff were pretty sure the Chinese would intervene, but his intelligence people were afraid to tell him anything he didn't want to hear. There's an old saying, he would shoot the enemy, or he would shoot the messenger, meaning, you'll be in trouble for telling him something contrary to what he believes. MacArthur had told President Truman had flown to Wake Island to have a meeting with him, and MacArthur had told Truman the Chinese would not dare to intervene. Well, in late November 1950, they did intervene with about 200,000 soldiers. This starts a push back, and then in the last couple of years of the war, it is kind of stalemated along basically fairly close to the line that had been the demarcation line between North and South Korea before the war. And it kind of stabilized there as the United States, China, North Korea, the Soviet Union, and South Korea began talking about ending the war. These are some ships used in the Incheon landing. Many naval experts told MacArthur this would not work, but it was a brilliant success. There's MacArthur sitting in a chair on a naval ship watching the landing. The Korean War was the first war in which there was any significant use of helicopters, although they would be much more heavily used in Vietnam. This is, if you've ever watched MASH, this is a pretty familiar helicopter. Wounded people their stretchers were strapped on to the outside of these helicopters on the racks and flown to mobile army surgical hospitals, that's what MASH stood for. This is Zhou Enlai, who was the prime minister or foreign minister of China at this time. He had stated, as the UN forces got up close to the Chinese border, he stated that China would not sit back and watch North Korea be ravaged by the imperialist dogs of the UN forces. This is a picture of Truman and MacArthur. Now, as the war kind of bogged down, this is a picture of some of the Chinese troops that were involved in the fighting after they invaded North Korea. The Chosin Reservoir, where U.S. Marines fought a long, very hard withdrawal, became one of the kind of iconic moments of the Korean War. Eventually, MacArthur began to speak out in ways that military commanders just cannot speak. Sometimes in the Vietnam conflict, you hear people say, well, we should have just let the Army do what they knew how to do. Well, stop and think about that. Do we really want a nation where the military leaders are not under the control of what today we can call the civilian command authority? When MacArthur began talking about bombing China and perhaps even it might become necessary to use nuclear weapons, Truman told him to shut up. And when he didn't, Truman fired him. Now, I think I have in my notes that a president can fire any officer at any time. I'm not sure that's correct, but he can fire any general officer, any officer in the rank of brigadier general or above, because generals have to be approved by the president before they are promoted to that rank. Now, eventually, the North Korean War was settled by an armistice. There still has not been a treaty to formally end the war, just an agreement to stop fighting. You'll see on this map here that shows you what had been the 38th parallel, the original line on the west side of the peninsula, the North Koreans control a little more territory than they did. On the east side of the peninsula, the South Koreans control a little more territory than they did. This is where it ended. Now, Korea was the first example America had been involved in of a limited war. A limited war for limited objectives. When we got involved, we did not say we are out to destroy North Korea and force them to unconditional surrender. We basically settled for just repelling the oppression or the invasion of South Korea and left it at that. But of course, the idea of a limited war is kind of hard to accept if you're one of the people that fought and was wounded or died, or if a member of your family died. And so after insisting on unconditional surrender in World War II, many Americans were kind of uncomfortable with this idea of a limited war. Now I want to go on and talk about Vietnam. Vietnam was somewhat similar in that after World War II, during World War II, the Japanese had taken control of Vietnam, which was a French colonial holding. And after the war, there was a settlement that divided it into zones of occupation. And in the 1950s, there was an agreement at Geneva in Switzerland. There was a meeting where it was decided that eventually Vietnam would all be united under one government. Now, the United States was not a party to that because we were not involved in Vietnam while it was still a French colony. But as time went on, it became clear that this reunification was not going to happen. The leaders in South Vietnam were pretty much convinced that if a vote was taken to unite the governments, that a communist government would take over all of Vietnam. And the leaders in South Vietnam were against that. Now, again, why the United States gets involved in Vietnam has a lot to do with Cold War thinking, with the idea that we cannot appease aggression. Also, in Europe, we did not want France to be embarrassed by losing control of Vietnam, because we hoped to keep the French as a firm anti-communist ally in Europe. Now, France never became truly allied with the Soviets, but they eventually did break away from NATO in the 1960s. Now, the French in South Vietnam, or actually in all of Vietnam, were fighting a war against an insurgency known as the Viet Cong, led by Ho Chi Minh, who was a Vietnamese nationalist who also was a communist. Americans tended to think of him primarily as a communist leader and tended to see Vietnam as just something that was orchestrated out of Moscow and Beijing, the capital of China. This largely was not true, although those nations did support the communist forces in Vietnam. This was largely a nationalist rebellion to throw off French colonial control. Eventually, the French lose the battle in Vietnam. In I don't have the exact date here, but the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, way up in the northern part of Vietnam. It's not shown on this map, but they had a major fortress there that was finally overrun by the Viet Cong. It is shown on this map. that was just it for the French. It was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. They decided to walk away from their commitment. Now, toward the end of the French involvement, the United States had been supplying them money and equipment to help fight, but no manpower, no advisors or no troops at all. Now, this is a picture of French paratroopers in the battle at Dien Bien Phu. And a Paris newspaper that says, I think Dien Bien Phu is dead. Now, Vietnam became known as the helicopter war. The helicopters were used in moving troops, in supplying troops, in evacuating casualties, and also equipped with machine guns and kind of like aerial cannon as an offensive weapon. The United States fought with a lot of heavy equipment like they had done in all wars, but this was a guerrilla type war, and some of that heavy equipment was hard to bring to bear on scattered, hidden elements of the enemy. This is a picture of a fire base of artillery troops in Vietnam. General William C. Westmoreland was the overall commander in Vietnam for most of the time when we were heavily involved. This is a picture of President Johnson. He flew to Vietnam to visit with Westmoreland. Now, it appears one of the problems in Vietnam is that nobody was getting correct information. Similar to what I talked about with MacArthur earlier, military and civilian officials, both in Vietnam, tended to think they could only report good news to the people on up the chain of command. And so MacArthur, for example, Westmoreland, for example, was always telling us there was light at the end of the tunnel. We see we're just about to turn the corner. This is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara had been Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and stayed in the cabinet after Kennedy was assassinated and served under President Johnson until he left the Defense Department in February 1968. Now, until 1965, we had only advisors and air power in Vietnam. We had advisors helping the South Vietnamese learn how to fight. We were supplying them, and we were using Americans to give them air support with bombing and strafing enemy positions and things like that. But in the spring of 1965, we sent the first ground troops to Da Nang. U.S. Marines were sent to protect an air base there. And then later that summer, we sent about 40,000 Army troops. And so we had changed the war from just advising the South Vietnamese to the idea that if we put more American troops in, we can get the war over more clearly or more quickly, or maybe not get it completely over, but get it down to the point where the South Vietnamese can handle it on their own. And then came the Tet Offensive. In January 1968, during the Vietnamese celebration of New Year, which is called the Tet celebration, the Viet Cong launched major attacks. Not only the Viet Cong, but the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong launched major attacks throughout South Vietnam. They took control of all 17 provincial capitals of South Vietnam. This is a picture of a Viet Cong prisoner being murdered by a South Vietnamese officer during Tet. This was the kind of thing that Vietnam was the first television war. People saw these pictures not only in television, but news magazines like Time and Life. And it began to raise the question of what kind of people are we supporting? This man, is just being executed. No, uh, no real protection for prisoners of war, as we say we believe in. Now, Tet was an interesting phenomena because within a few weeks, the American and South Vietnamese forces had taken back everything, and they had hit the communist forces very hard. Militarily, it was a defeat for the communist forces. But to Americans, it seemed to be a turning point. If we had been told so long that we were just about to win this war, and then the communist forces could pull this off, then Americans began to turn against the war. Now, in 1968, remember some things we haven't talked a great deal about in the lecture on the civil rights movement. Remember, Martin Luther King was killed in April 1968. Robert F. Kennedy was killed in June of 68. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson had announced in March that he would not seek re-election, and his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, eventually became the Democratic nominee. Richard Nixon, many people thought Nixon was probably dead. He hadn't been heard from since he had lost the California governor's race in 1962. He came back from political oblivion to become the Republican nominee in 1968 and to win a close election over Humphrey. Nixon in 1960 had lost a close election to Kennedy. 68, he wins a close election against Humphrey. And in 72, he won a landslide against George McGovern. Nixon claimed he had a secret plan to end the war. Of course, the beauty of a secret plan is I can't tell you what it is. But his plan was basically Vietnamization. And as soon as he took office in January 1969, he began this process that we would go back to the idea that we are there to advise and support the South Vietnamese, but they are going to have to win the war on their own. Nixon began bringing home troops in large numbers. This is a picture of the Vietnam Memorial. These comments I'm going to make about this are from Stephen Ambrose. I heard this in a speech that he made at Kansas State. The real tragedy of Vietnam is that about half the people who died there, about half the American soldiers and military personnel who died in Vietnam, died after we decided we wouldn't win this war. The Vietnam Memorial is a wall in a V shape, and the apex of the V, where the two wings of the wall meet, is 1968. Lyndon Johnson had decided not to run because he thought we would lose Vietnam, and he did not want to be responsible for that. Richard Nixon, I firmly believe, even though I have a much more positive view of Nixon than a lot of people, I am convinced Nixon knew exactly what was going to happen. We will support the South Vietnamese. We will eventually pull out. They will last a little while, but eventually the communist forces would take over. So half the people in Vietnam, half the American military personnel who died there, died after our leaders had pretty much decided this was a lost cause. Now, Nixon had been bringing home troops. The anti-war movement had pretty much quieted down. I don't have the exact date, but Nixon also ended the draft before the war ended. But when it was found out that we had secretly gone into Cambodia, searching for places where the communist forces took refuge, this prompted a renewal of the anti-war movement, and the deaths at Kent State in Ohio, Kent State University, happened in the context of this. Peaceful students that were protesting this perceived re-escalation of the war were shot into by a group of Ohio National Guardsmen, and 4 students were killed there. Now, in 1972, actually, when Johnson announced in '68 that he was not going to run again, he asked Hanoi to begin peace talks, and peace talks began fairly quickly after that. But for 4 years, they virtually went nowhere, largely because the South Vietnamese could see the handwriting on the wall, that if there is a peace treaty and the U.S. pulls out, eventually the South will fall to North Vietnam. But behind the scenes, Henry Kissinger, who was first Nixon's national security advisor and then became his Secretary of State, was meeting with Lee Doc To, the chief negotiator for North Vietnam. And by the fall of 1972, they had the basic frame of a deal done. And right before the 1972 election, this is where we get the term October surprise, when an incumbent president pulls off some big thing right before the election. We sometimes call this an October surprise. I'm sure this was all just purely coincidental, but just weeks before the election, Kissinger says peace is at hand. Now, eventually, we did sign a treaty in January 1973. The U.S. continued bringing home troops. We quickly got out all of our combat forces. We still had advisors in for a brief time more. Finally, I'm going to go back to that previous, well, I guess it won't let me go back to that previous slide. That previous slide was when South Vietnam finally fell in April 1975. That picture of helicopters landing on top of the apartment buildings within the grounds of the U.S. Embassy. We were trying to get out not only our own personnel, but people, South Vietnamese people who had worked with us, because we knew they were in trouble when the communist forces took over. Out in the South China Sea, these helicopters were flying out there to U.S. ships, but there were so many helicopters trying to land, there was no room for them. So helicopters landed, they unloaded the people, and then these helicopters worth thousands of dollars were just pushed off into the sea in order to try to save more people. It was kind of a fittingly embarrassing moment for the end of our commitment. Eventually, the prisoners of war came back, and for a long time, Americans had a hard time dealing with Vietnam. This is the Vietnam Memorial at night, and this is a statue of the 3 fighting men that was added. Many people thought that this wall it was not typical of our other kinds of memorials, so they wanted some kind of a statue. And eventually there also was a statue of some nurses added to memorialize the women's role in Vietnam. My father died in February 1998. The last few years before he died, he kept kind of a diary, but it was a strange diary because he didn't write anywhere near every day. And when he did write, it might be a sentence, or it might be 3 or 4 lines. It might be a sentence like, planted tomatoes today. Mark and his kids here for supper tonight. My dad read all the time. And in the fall of '97, he was reading one of the biographies of Lyndon Johnson. My dad would send me this diary for each year, the last 3 or 4 years before he died, and asked me to type it up. And then I would make copies and send it back to him. And that last year, he had been reading this biography of Johnson. And he said, yes, Lyndon Johnson was the worst president we ever had. Got us involved in that damned war in Vietnam. And then he crossed it out. He wrote a note at the bottom. He said, Mark, don't type this. I don't want to offend your brothers who fought there. I had two brothers that fought in Vietnam. My oldest brother was a career Marine officer who was a brigadier general by the time he retired, but he was a captain and then a major in his 2 tours in Vietnam. That's him in the blue sweater on the right. The brother that was the closest in age to me, about 6.5 years older than I am, Dwight, with the white beard. He went to Vietnam as a enlisted man. Back in those days, this was kind of common. If you had had some trouble in high school, the principal might tell you, when we see some enlistment papers, you'll see your diploma. And that's why Dwight went. And he joined the Marines voluntarily rather than wait to be drafted into the Army. They both came home. They both survived. But everybody, even those like me that were too young, we were impacted by this war in ways that I'm not sure we will ever understand. Well, thank you.